Hello, everyone. There are places in Oregon where the air seems to hold on to the past, where fog and memory sit in the same breath. Tonight, I bring you 9 first-hand accounts from people who walked those places and carried back something no map could maim. This recording contains accounts of violence, abduction, and disturbing discoveries. Listener discretion advised. If these stories matter to you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future collections like this. There is value in staying aware. I am 26 years old now. When I was 19, I took a night shift at a motel on the coast because I needed the rent money and the town was small enough that every job felt like family. The motel sat a block from the ocean, a low building with a neon sign that buzzed like a slow insect. The proprietor, an older man who called himself Tom, was kind in the way of people who have been worn down into gentleness. My nights were mostly quiet. I folded towels, checked rooms, made coffee, and listened to the wind pull at the eaves. The inciting thing was small at first, a car that never seemed to leave. It would roll in late, idling past the office, and then stay in the same spot until dawn. I asked Tom about it. He shrugged and said some truckers slept there. One night, around 2 in the morning, I heard something at the back door. A soft, wet sound, like fabric against wood, and a high keening that might have been a woman or might have been a gull. I walked out with the office flashlight and saw one of the room's curtains move, though the window was dark. My first reaction was annoyance. Guests smoke sometimes, and the wind moves things. But there was a smell, too. Salt and something that did not belong. Cheap perfume lingering too far from its source. Escalation came over the next week. The car returned nightly. The guests checked in at odd hours and left with eyes that never met mine. Once, a guest in room 7 knocked on my door to ask for extra towels, and his hands were rough and ink-stained, but his fingers trembled. He would not tell me where he was from. Another night, I caught a glimpse through the office door of a woman sitting in the lobby, arms wrapped around herself, face hidden. She left before I could speak to her. When she passed the office, the perfume hit me again, synthetic and sweet, and smeared over a sourness under it. I began to feel foolish, sensitive, a nervous kid imagining danger where there was none. But one morning during a cleaning round, I found a photograph tucked underneath a mattress pad. The photo showed 3 people at a summer fair. One of the faces matched the woman I had seen. On the back of the photo, someone had written a name and a date. My stomach went cold. I put the photo in an envelope and called the local sheriff's office. I tried to keep my voice steady. They came and took the photo and the car's license plate number I'd noted. They told me there had been reports, missing persons from nearby towns, some folks taken from campsites along the coast. They asked me questions about the motel, about Tom. Tom said nothing. He told the deputies he had no idea and that he barely noticed the guests. Climax arrived on a night a week later when the woman in the lobby bolted toward the beach and then stopped, looking over her shoulder as if listening to something only she could hear. I followed at a distance. The fog was thick and the neon of the sign smeared like a bruise across the street. I could hear metal clanging somewhere, the motel's ancient boiler or the old pier. Then a shout, low and angry, came from behind the last line of dune grass. A figure lunged from the shadow, and another grabbed the woman. I ran forward and shouted until my voice was raw. The man left her and fled into the fog. The woman collapsed into my arms. She spoke in broken fragments. "They keep us. They take photos. And then she vomited, and we waited for the sheriff. The aftermath was procedural and awful. The woman was taken to a shelter. She disclosed that she had been moved between properties, traded with men who thought towns like ours were invisible. The woman did not want to testify at first. There were arrests later, men detained on unrelated charges whose names showed up in the motel's ledger. Some were prosecuted, others slipped through holes in the system. The motel closed down months later. Tom sold it, said he was tired, and moved away. Now, when I drive that stretch of road, the neon is a memory, and the wind tastes like salt and old photograph paper. I still have the reflex to look for cars that stay overnight. The thing that follows me is not a face, but the sound of paper sliding across a table, the sound of someone sliding a photograph back and forth and making decisions about which lives to keep. That sound is what keeps me awake sometimes, the quiet clack of another person's life being catalogued and sold. Hello, the next voice is from farther inland, and if you listen for the clanging I keep mentioning, you'll hear why I use it as a thread between these places. The saw and the mill are older than many of the houses in these towns. The sound seems to stitch the past into the present. I am 32 years old now. When I was 23, I took seasonal work at an abandoned timber mill on the outskirts of a township that had more ghosts than streetlights. My job was to clear the site for a restoration project, pull out rusted nails, read blueprints, and dig where the engineers said to dig. The mill had been silent for decades. The saw teeth were still half buried in a shed, their edges black with the memory of sawdust. Everyone in town told stories about accidents there, men disappearing into the dark, the mill swallowing someone whole. But those were the sorts of tales you hear when a place loses its purpose. I believed in work and in rational explanation. The inciting oddity was a child's shoe.
When roads narrow and trees press close, people tend to excuse the unease, blame the weather, blame the fog. The next person I spoke with learned another reason those roads feel odd. I am 29 years old now. When I was 21, I was traveling between towns to sell produce out of the back of a van, a summer hustle. I knew Highway 26 like the back of my hand, where the maples lean, where the shoulder disappears into bracken, where a single yellow reflector announces an intersection that is not marked on any GPS. On one run, I missed a turn and took a gravel back road that ran along an old logging road. There, the fog came down so fast it was like a wall. My radio cut out, then came back with static that sounded like whispers. The small oddity was a house at the edge of a clearing with all its lights off. Nobody lived there, or so the local kids said. They called it the house without a name. That night I pulled over to check my map. A light moved inside, blue and thin, like someone pacing by a lamp. I watched because I had been bored. The van's engine was a low, constant heartbeat. The fog smelled of wet pine and a faint sweetness, like a kitchen you haven't been in for a long time. Escalation happened when, as I approached, I saw a woman in the doorway. She wore a jacket too thin for the cold, and she looked at me with that cold, astonished look of someone who was just beginning to understand that they had been watched. She didn't speak at first. Then she gripped my sleeve and said hurriedly, "They take the road at night. They pick people who are alone." She tugged me toward the van and warned me not to stop at the old parking lot. She told me she'd gotten away once and had been hiding. There were scratches on her forearms, like someone had tried to hold on. I drove with my hands tight on the wheel, listening to the press of trees and thinking about all the times you convince yourself you were lucky. The woman begged me to call the sheriff. I did. A patrol car rolled up 10 minutes later and shone its light like a question into the fog. The officers searched the woods and the old parking lot and found a makeshift camp with tarps and 4x4s. They found photographs, Polaroids, of travelers, sometimes with their eyes blacked out with ink, sometimes with objects laid beside them like trophies. The sheriff's office cataloged them and took them away. Climax for me was the day a man was arrested on that stretch of road. They brought charges related to abduction and evidence from several sites. He had a clean record on paper, but a trail of small people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. At his arraignment, the man looked like a neighbor's father, harsh jaw, ordinary shirt, and the judge read lists of names. Not all cases ended the same way. Some were too complicated to tie to a single arrest. But that man's prosecution changed things. There were nightly patrols and new reflectors on the shoulder. The woman who spoke to me moved away, quietly.
She called once to say she had found work in the city and that she slept without checking the windows now. She asked me never to say where we had met. The last thing she told me before she hung up was to trust the small alarms in our bodies. The hair that stands on the arm, the part of you that says, "This is not right." I think of that line often when I drive through fog. The haunting picture is not of the man in court, but of the photos taken at the parking lot, faces arranged like trophies, the flash of a Polaroid catching ordinary eyes and turning them into evidence. Between these stories, the motif of trophies, objects taken and kept, keeps reappearing. The next voice talks about objects and what people do with them. I am 24 years old now. When I was 18, I worked nights in a convenience store on a highway that people used as a shortcut. The town's gas pumps were older than some of its residents. I rang up cigarettes and coffee and asked customers about the weather because that is what clerks do when there is nothing else to say. I also learned the rhythm of people who stopped long-term, truck drivers who took the same booth, teenagers who passed through, and once in a while, someone who looked like they were learning how to lie. The oddity began with a locket. A woman came into the store and bought a bottle of water and a notebook, and she left the locket on the counter. It was engraved crudely, like it had been worked on in a hurry. She left, then came back, minutes later, leaving the locket again. And the third time she returned, she was crying. She told me to keep it for a minute while she used the phone. I held it and felt the weight of someone else's life in the metal. Escalation came when more items started appearing. Rings, a child's bracelet, a scrap of a dress, left anonymously at the counter. People would drop things off and say, "If anyone asks, I found this," or they wouldn't say anything at all. The items made a small pile in a box behind the counter. I didn't realize how much it would mean until one morning when a man came in asking for something he said he had lost. His hands trembled as he described a ring. He left angry and then called the sheriff, insisting someone had stolen from him. The sheriff's office traced the items through pawn shop logs and found a chain connecting men who sold jewelry to unknown buyers. The items were being used as currency. Climax occurred when a woman came back and identified several items in that box as hers. She was gaunt and spoke in bursts, about being kept, about being promised money, about being moved between properties. She said most people who saw the men thought they were harmless. That was the worst part. The sheriff filed reports and followed leads. Men who were arrested had inventories of objects catalogued as personal effects. The term felt clinical for the things that had been used to control people. The aftermath included a community-led drive to create a place where people could leave found items without shame. A bulletin at the church, a locked box at the library. I volunteered. The box became, in a small way, a ledger of what people refused to forget. The haunting image that stays with me is the locket on my palm, its engraving smudged by hands that had been working to survive. Objects can carry stories. Sometimes they carry cries. Listen for the sea and the mill and the highway. They are the bones of these towns. The next voice remembers a house that should have been safe. I am 35 years old now. When I was 27, I moved into a farmhouse a half-mile outside town because it was cheap and because I liked the quiet. My wife and I wanted space for our son, so we took on the creaks and the sagging porch and the well that needed a new pump. The house had belonged to an older couple who had died in a nursing home and left the place to rot for a while. The neighbors told us the couple had kept to themselves, which is another way small towns say, "Don't go poking." The small oddity was the attic door that smelled of rust and old wool whenever I opened it. We found an old trunk containing photographs, letters, and a ledger with names and dates. Some of the names matched townspeople, others did not. I thought it was the usual accumulation of life, birthdays, births, marriages. But then I found a list of initials with nights and times next to them, as if someone had recorded arrivals. A hand had underlined certain entries. Escalation was slow. We started to find small signs that someone had been in the house after dark. A cup set in the sink we hadn't left, a towel on the floor with hair in it. One night, my son woke up and said there was a man at the foot of his bed watching him. I saw the fear in my wife's face and felt something clamp over my chest. We installed new locks, but locks are only good as long as the person outside is not someone you think you know. One afternoon, a woman came to our door who said she had once worked at the farmhouse years ago. She spoke haltingly about being brought there by a man who said he would help her find work. She described a basement room with a low ceiling and a mattress and a calendar where someone had circled certain dates. She said she had escaped and that other people had not. I called the sheriff and handed them the trunk and the ledger. The sheriff's office sent officers who logged the items and took statements. Climax unfolded when they excavated an old storage area under the back porch and found evidence of habitation, blankets, containers, and more photographs. The investigation revealed that the house had been used by a small group to hold people in for short periods. Some of those held had managed to run, others remained missing. A local man was arrested weeks later, and his trial revealed a network that had used several properties like the farmhouse to move people between them.
The resolution left a bruise on the town. Some neighbors denied they had seen anything. Others gathered donations for survivors. My family moved out eventually, unable to sleep with the knowing that a place designed to shelter could be a trap. The image that clings to me is simple. The ledger's inked initials, each a night someone else had decided to keep track of human lives like inventory. And the echo of a child's voice saying there was a man by his bed. That is the sound I hear when the house settles at night. Between towns, the question of why people stay silent recurs. The next narrator learned how communities can protect secrets with polite smiles. I am 28 years old now. When I was 20, I worked at a diner on the main street of a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, but only in comfortable fragments. The diner's coffee tasted like it had lived there its whole life. People came and left, and the talk was mostly about bills and accent and the weather. One morning, a young woman came in with a bruise on her cheek and sat in my booth, and didn't order. She watched the street like someone expecting something. The small oddity was the way everyone else kept eating, as if the bruise belonged to the world and not to a person. Restaurant regulars made sympathetic noises and then went back to their pancakes. She finally left a note on the table for me. "Don't say anything to them." I kept my hands folded above the register and watched her disappear down an alley. Escalation came when a man began to show up at the diner late at night, asking for directions and for anyone who worked the graveyard shift. He had the sort of smile that suggested he liked being listened to. He sat at the counter and told stories about hunting in the woods and about people who owed him money. When he left, he would toss me a 10 and wink like we were in on something. One night, the woman with the bruise ran in and hid in the kitchen. She told me, shaking, that she had been taken and sold to men he knew, that she had escaped but feared returning would mean more. She gave me names, only nicknames, and described a house where men sometimes brought people. I called the sheriff. They investigated and found that the man was part of a group that used the town's invisibility and people's habit of looking the other way to their advantage. Neighbors had seen trucks at unusual hours and had assumed they were late-night work crews. The man was arrested after a coordinated move that included tips from a few brave locals. The resolution was a mixed bag. Some people celebrated, some stood in denial. The woman moved away. The diner kept serving coffee. I think the haunting image is not the man's arrest, but the way life resumed the next day, as if everything had been put back into place with no visible seam. The town stitched itself together with silence and said the cut was only a scratch. That seam is what bothers me. How easy it is to keep going when justice arrives, and how much living people can absorb. The next account is quieter, and it involves the water. Rivers in these parts carry old things downstream. I am 31 years old now. When I was 22, I guided people on canoe trips down a river that cuts through old-growth stands. I loved the water, its slow intelligence, the way it kept its own counsel. We would stop at a waterfall to let people swim and listen to stories about drowned things that belonged to other centuries. The waterfall was a place where the current made patterns on your skin. The inciting detail was a child's backpack caught beneath roots at the river's lip, bright blue and coated with silt. I found it during a private trip with 2 clients who were interns in town. We dragged the pack out and found items: a lunchbox sticker, a cling of hair in a hair elastic, clothes too small for adult hands. We took the pack to the sheriff's office. They thanked us but moved with the slowness of agencies stretched thin. Escalation was the discovery that the river had been a dumping ground used by men who thought rivers would erase what they wanted to hide. Later, divers found evidence along the banks, items, and, in one stretch, a place where the current had shifted and revealed a human bone. I won't describe the bone. It was catalogued as human remains in the report, and that is what I learned to say because it kept the thing factual and not monstrous. Climax came with a search and with local people walking the banks and calling names. A community memorial was held for those we could name, lanterns set on the water and folded into the current like promises. The sheriff's office arrested a man after linking a string of missing person reports to a property upstream. He was charged in part because of much small patient work, people noticing vans, checking registration, following up quietly. The aftermath was that people began to travel in pairs to the waterfall. We paused ceremonial paddles, and I refused to take solo trips for months. A tribal elder from a nearby community asked to speak at a memorial and told us in general terms to remember that the river remembers, that the river keeps score in a way we cannot always see. That counsel guided the town's actions: more light at the trailhead, a registry for people going in, the beginnings of a culture of watching for one another. The haunting image that stays with me is a child's backpack watching the water pass through its buckles, carrying light away as if it were a witness that had been waiting to be found. There is a different kind of quiet in abandoned schoolhouses. The next story comes from someone who found that silence harder to bear. I am 27 years old now. When I was 19, I worked with a nonprofit that repurposed old buildings into art spaces. One place we restored was an old schoolhouse that had been shuttered for decades.
We were there to clear decades of gum and lost pencils and to peel back layers of time. The paint on the walls had once been bright, then faded to the color of old papers. The desks still had names carved into them. The small oddity was the sound that came from the gym when the building was empty, a clanging like a distant machine that had no source. We assumed it was pipes or the wind, but the sound had weight and rhythm. A friend who lived across the street told me locals avoided the place at night because of the sound and because children had once disappeared in the county and never been explained. Escalation occurred as we found evidence that the school had been used for more than classes. Mattresses in the basement, tin cans, a ledger of names. Someone had left drawings that showed roads made of teeth and trees with faces. The drawings were childish, but the margins had adult handwriting, addresses, times. We catalogued the items and turned them over to the authorities. Climax came when a former teacher showed up at the site and told us about a time when kids would leave school and never return. He spoke in a low voice and said that back then people were afraid of accusing one another because who would they accuse? He told us he had suspected a parent, then another neighbor, and kept quiet. His confession prompted new interviews. An investigation looked back at old files and found patterns. Children who had stopped attending and whose absences had been explained away. There were arrests years later tied to those records, but they never made the kind of tidy closure that a small town wants. The resolution for me was that the gym's clanging stopped after we locked up one night and someone smashed an old weight machine that had been rigged to bang when the wind hit it. Whether something else had been making the noise, I cannot say. The teacher gave a short eulogy at an informal memorial we held in the school's yard, and people left stones on the threshold. The haunting memory that wouldn't leave me was not the arrests or the machine, but the drawings, small hands making monstrous maps, because they showed how children understand danger in ways adults don't, and they taught me to pay attention to the quiet of play. Not every haunted place is large. Sometimes menace is practiced close to home. The next voice speaks of a neighbor and the private rules that let danger persist. I am 34 years old now. When I was 25, I rented a room in an older house to save money. My roommate was a man who worked nights at the mill and who smiled too often when he told you about what he had done. He seemed harmless at first, quiet, a little guarded.
We shared bills and dishes and a thin wall that did not keep in sound. The inciting oddity was that items from my bag would sometimes end up in his room. A watch I misplaced for a day would turn up in his drawer. I confronted him about it once, and he laughed and said he was just looking out for me.
I should have left then. I didn't. Escalation was subtle. He began to ask who I dated, where I worked, and what time I'd be gone. I told myself it was curiosity. Small actions accumulated. Calls to my job that I hadn't placed. A photograph taken of me through the window when he thought I couldn't see. He began to invite friends over who smelled like oil and whiskey, and I noticed them watching me more than the TV. I started sleeping with my keys under my pillow. Climax arrived one night when he blocked my door and said bluntly that I owed him, and that the house made things easy. I remember the exact sentence. "You know how this works." I grabbed my bag and left, running into the street with the keys still under my pillow, and I found a neighbor to let me cry on his porch until dawn. I called the sheriff, and they came and took a statement. The man was prosecuted months later after other women came forward with similar stories. He was charged with a pattern of harassment and exploitative behavior. The case never portrayed him as monstrous on its face. He was simply cruel and controlling, an ordinary predator. The aftermath was a long period of watching my back and a slow rebuilding of trust. My landlord changed the locks and put up motion sensor lights. The haunting memory is of him by my door, smiling as if the house were an instrument and I had been a note he plucked. What stays with me is how quietly a person's life can be claimed in the familiar spaces of home. There are places where legend leans hard on warning. The next voice listened to elders who said, "Respect the land." I am 30 years old now. When I was 22, I was hiking a trail near a waterfall that locals called the place where paths twist. An elder from a nearby tribe once told me in general terms to keep to the trail and to never whistle in the trees. Advice framed as respect, not threat. I thought of that talk as folklore, a poetic way to keep people safe. I learned otherwise. The inciting detail was a compass that spun without settling. I had taken it from a thrift store because I liked knowing direction. On the trail it trembled like a toy, its needle refusing to point. The air around the falls was thick and white, and my phone lost signal. I noticed how the light bent there, how time seemed a hair slower. I passed a cairn of stones with odd marks and thought it was visitors piling something together, until I heard a laugh like a child's voice that came from nowhere. Escalation came in the form of time. I would pause at a rock to catch my breath and then look up to find the sun lower than it should be. Streams that had been shallow at noon were dark and deep an hour later. People in town told stories about days stretching out, of hunters losing an afternoon and finding it months later. I started to feel fuzzy at the edges after visits to that place. A friend returned from the trail and could not explain where 2 hours had gone. He only remembered a series of stones and a clanging bell far off. Climax was not dramatic in the usual sense. I found myself stepping off the path to follow a small fox trail and realized I had walked for what felt like a day and was not yet near the falls. I panicked and then remembered the elder's general admonition, "Keep to the trail." I turned back and the trail rearranged itself. I swear to this that the trees seemed to have shifted to show me the way. Once back at the parking area, the clock on the dashboard read a time that did not match the sun, and everyone I spoke to in town treated it like a private, embarrassed joke. A heavy fog rolled in that night and did not lift until dawn.
The resolution was simply a series of decisions. I stopped hiking there alone, and I began listening when elders offered cautionary words. A small group in town placed a sign at the trailhead that said, in careful neutral language, "Respect local guidance. Stay on marked trails." People complied, more out of courtesy than belief. The haunting is not an apparition or a person, but the sensation of time unmooring, of losing 3 hours and remembering only the sound of a bell and the taste of river stone. At the end of a night like this, the host returns to weave the motifs: fog, clanging metal, trophies, ledgered names, into something close to meaning. I am the one who collected these testimonies, and the one who listened to the small, ordinary things that led to alarm. Across coastlines and mills, highways and schoolhouses, a pattern repeats. Ordinary lives intersecting with people who believe isolation is invisibility. The fog is literal sometimes and metaphorical the rest of the time. It is the thing that hides a car, the way towns look away, the way secrets gather like mold in a damp cellar. The clanging metal that appears in more than one story ties memory to place. The saw, the furnace, a weight machine, an industrial noise that outlives its makers and calls out to those who would use silence for harm. If these stories have touched you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications to hear more collections like this. If you live in a small town or travel isolated roads, share safety tips in the comments. Respectful, practical advice that might help someone else. And if you know of local history that needs attention, pass it on to trusted authorities. Sometimes community vigilance is the only light a place will get. Thank you for listening. If you have a story like these, something from a place where the fog settles and something doesn't quite add up, share it carefully and consider contacting local resources that can help. Stay aware, watch for the little things that feel wrong, and tell someone when you hear the clanging that doesn't belong. After the recorded thanks, a man in the back of the room raised his hand.
It had come in from a town 2 hours down the highway where the mill had closed in the 70s and the bell had been silenced for years. He spoke slow, with a voice like gravel. "You should look at the ledgers," he said. "Not the official ones. There are other books." He left a folded sheet of paper on the table when he went. On it was an address and a single sentence. "If you want to know why the bell keeps calling, start with what people left behind." The next morning, I drove the gravel spur until the road narrowed to ruts and the trees closed in over the hood with the impatient calm of hands. The house at the address was not a house so much as a pile of years stacked against itself. The roof sagged in one corner like a tired eyebrow. The porch leaned, and the windows held the particular film that comes from 1,000 winters of unwashed light. A sign nailed to a post read, in paint chipped and deliberate, "Brackets Repair." Inside, the smell was oil and damp paper. Machines that hadn't moved in decades gathered dust in a pattern that suggested they had been left mid-work, as if someone had stepped away expecting to come back in an hour and never had the chance. There was a small bell on a shelf with a wooden handle, nothing ornate, the sort of bell used to call a crew in from lunch. It sat as if listening. Elda Brackett answered the knock herself. She was thin as a rail, with a braid of white hair that hung down her back like a tail. Her hands were stained with rust and tea. When I told her who I was and what I'd been collecting, she did not ask for an explanation. She poured coffee, moved a stack of envelopes with a patience that suggested those papers had always been there. "You heard the clanging then," she said, without preamble. I nodded. She smiled.
Not the pleasant smile people give to be polite, but the kind that had learned to accept things without agreement. She shuffled a little and brought out a ledger bound in leather, its spine cracked, its pages edged with the brown of old leaves. This was the book the man had hinted at, a private accounting that belonged to the Brackett mill. The cover had names stamped in a hand that had decided long ago to be careful. Trophies, Ledger. Inside, the entries were a mixture of ordinary bookkeeping and a strange cataloging. There were dates and amounts, payment for coal, receipts for bolts, but threaded among them were names and items, short descriptors like ring, left on bench, boots, found by river, hammer, in locker. Some lines read like an inventory, others read like a confession. Each entry ended with initials, BR, or sometimes just 2 dots. After the mill closed, Elda said, fingers tracing a margin, people brought things. Not everyone wanted to keep them.
Some wanted them logged. Some wanted them hidden. You can't just leave a bell ringing in a place where the air will listen. She tapped the ledger. We kept a record of what was taken off the floor. Men stole parts. Men brought souvenirs. Sometimes they brought what shouldn't exist anymore. I asked how far back the ledger went. The leather swallowed the question. She opened to a page and pointed. The earliest entry was dated 1942. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, as if written between the din of work. There were names of workers, then names of townsfolk, some local, some who'd come down the line when the mill ran day and night during the war. The last column, in a different hand and with a smear of nicotine, recorded an event. Bell at 3:12 p.m. Man lost for 2 hours. Another line. Fog thicker afternoon. Watchman eaten clocks. The phrasing was elliptical, as if the ledger had been used to compress the messy into the manageable. As I read, the pattern outlined itself like a map revealed by rain. Entries clustered around dates when the town reported unusual fog, late autumn and early spring, times when the atmospheric shift could be blamed and then dismissed. The ledger kept track of items, every trophy given a short note, sometimes a place, riverbank, locker room, sometimes nothing at all. The initials at the end were always the same, BR for bracket repair, then in later pages a new hand, CM, which meant someone else had been adding lines when Elda's husband grew too tired. There were gaps, years in which nothing was written, then pages full again as if someone had remembered all at once. "Did you ever try to return these things?" I asked. She gave a laugh that did not reach her eyes. Return? To whom? Some of the ones who'd been lost came back and wanted nothing to do with what they'd left. Others couldn't take things apart. Trophies kept a weight on people's hands. There was talk. A few families took items to the police, but by then the police thought it was grief. People grow used to oddness. I told her about the names in other towns, of men who stepped away and never found the missing hours, and asked her if any were mentioned in the ledger. She exhaled and opened farther back. The ledger had margins filled with dates, and next to some names, a looping script that looked like a signature and a notation, ledgered. The word recurred enough to read like a ritual. Ledgered, she said, means catalogued, means spoken for. Her finger hovered over a line. Look here, 1969, a batch of items. 2 men went out for lunch and never came back till the next morning. One couldn't remember the bell. The other didn't remember anything after his sandwich. People say the bell wakes the old work in a place. The bell remembers. Outside, the wind rose, and for a moment the house whispered with the sound of old doors deciding whether to stay shut.
In that thin slot of weather, something in the distance rang, far off, like a tongue striking metal once, 2, 3 times. It could have been a tractor at the next farm, or someone hammering. But Elda straightened and listened, as if for a language. "You don't have to believe me," she said. "Stories don't ask for belief. They need witnesses." She pressed the ledger into my hands. "Take it," she said, "but be careful with it. Things that get written down sometimes want to be read aloud." I left with the ledger under my arm like contraband. Back in the car, I ran my thumb over the cover and felt the impression of long closed palms. The town as I left it seemed to flex inward, the trees casting odd spines of shadow across the road, and the sky loomed the color of old pewter. I drove to the cemetery, because ledger names belong on stone as much as on paper. The cemetery sat on a low rise behind the church, a patchwork of rounded headstones and tall, clean veterans' markers. The ledger's names appeared on monuments: an H. Carrow, M. Delaney, P. Rowe, names that reappeared in towns up and down the valley. Some stones had no initials, only dates. Some had nothing but a polished oval of blank granite where a name had once been and been erased. For several graves, the dates ended abruptly in the middle of a line, as if a chisel had stopped mid-stroke. I made copies of the names with my phone and cross-checked them with public death records. The ledger's lost hours coincided with coroner's notes that puzzled but did not accuse. A heart attack in a field with no witness. A man found hours later wandering in town without his shoes. A woman who could not remember her name. There were patterns, the clustering around certain months, the bodies found near old industrial sites, the repetition of the same bell motif in witness statements that the authorities had filed away as anecdotal. At the county office, an archivist named Marco helped me sort through maps and boxes of scanned newspapers. He had the kind of curiosity that asked questions as much for the joy of asking as for the hope of answers. "Once you start to notice the things other people have smoothed over," he said, flipping a brittle newspaper from 1951, "you see them everywhere." Between the articles about harvests and school plays were small columns summing up municipal minutiae. The bell silent in the square, a factory fined for emissions, a fire at a storage facility. Marco pointed to a notice from 1978, local foundry to remove former shift bell for safety. The article gave no reason for the removal other than municipal caution and noise complaints. The foundry's lot had been cleared 2 years later and turned into apartments. The bell, according to one anonymous tip, had ended up in a private collection. "People take parts of places," Marco said. "They carry off the edges so they don't have to think about the whole." Back at the ledger, late in the afternoon, I began to chart the entries on a fold-out map. I used colored pins and string, not because a network would explain anything, but because making lines felt like a way to keep miles from dissolving into one another. The pins crawled along the ridgeline, the falls, the mill, the foundry, a tannery, an old weight factory whose brick facade had been pocked by lightning. The strings looped back to the same point more than once. The bell marked a rhythm through all of it. There was one cluster I could not explain, a series of names from towns that, on the face of it, had nothing to do with industry. An entry read simply, 1839, children lost, bell heard at dusk. Another from 1911 said, fair day, 2 booths unopened, sound like metal. These were older than the bracket mill. The ledger, I realized, was stitching together a history of noise, of things that didn't belong to the present, but returned to call across generations. I called one of the families listed in the ledger, an old woman named Ruth in a trailer that had the look of being anchored to the ground by the weight of its history. Her house smelled of lemon oil and old wool. She remembered the day her brother had come back from the woods with a pocket full of small iron discs and nothing to say for the hours he could not account for. He was different after that, she told me. Small things would set him off, a clanging pot, a clock. He'd stare at it like he held a secret in his throat. When I asked where the discs had gone, she said with an almost casual sorrow, "We burned them. What else can you do with things that want to keep counting?" The stories multiplied in my notes, and the ledger sat under a lamp that hummed quietly. Each entry was a suggestion more than a claim, a breadcrumb. There were threads between the towns, not tightly knotted, more like hairlines of old worry. Men with boxes of trophies, pockets full of small iron. Bell sounds remembered at the edges of memory. Fog that gathered in one place and decided not to leave. That week, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside, on a single sheet, was a photocopy of a page from a hospital log, and, taped to it, a photograph. The log entry recorded a patient who had arrived disoriented after being found on a roadway, hours missing. The photograph was grainy, a metal sign half buried in moss, the letters rusted but legible, reading, "South Falls, keep to the trail." The card was unsigned. Whoever had sent it wanted me to go back to the falls. Return is always the moment a story tightens. The sky was a wash of early light when I met 2 others who had answered the same thread. Marco, the archivist, holding a small satchel of maps, and Lena, a young cartographer who had been following rumors about places where maps and memory diverged. She had a tripod and a camera, like someone expecting to document rather than to narrate.
There was also a 4th person we didn't pick up until the dirt road. An older man with a folded cane and a smile that seemed to hold an apology. He would only say his name was Tom, and that he had been moved by the ledger to come, because he had once been near a bell when something wanted his hours. We drove in convoy to the trailhead, windows down though the air was thin and cold. The parking area had the feel of a place used to being left empty. Someone had nailed the new sign, the one the town had put up, square and polite. The forest beyond it was green and dark, the trunks straight as question marks. As we strapped packs to shoulders and did the practical things people do before going somewhere uncertain, there was a small, far-off clank. It wavered, almost polite enough to be dismissed, but every head tilted toward it, like a family listening for the name of a lost child. "Keep to the trail," Lena said, as if reading ourselves back to reason. It sounded less like advice than liturgy. We walked. The path sloped, then bent, and the light, cleverer than a lamp, fell in bands through leaves. We passed the cairn of stones where I'd first heard the childlike laugh.
Someone, years before, had stacked the rocks deliberately, faces turned toward the river as if in benediction. The sound of water was below us, blank and steady. The compass in my pocket moved in little fits. Lena's device read nonsense, the numbers shifting as if the ground were a magnet that had forgotten its own rules. An hour in, the air changed. Fog rolled like a breath caught and held, and the day dulled to the color of bone. The trees took on the look of columns in a cathedral built by absence. At something that might have been a clearing, but could have been another trick of light, we stopped. The bell, if that is what it was, came then, not distant, but as if a hand had brushed a pan. It was a sound that held within it the smell of iron and the taste of river-stone. Tom, who had walked bent forward with the care of someone with a body older than his will, folded his cane and stood straighter. He closed his eyes. "Hear it?" he asked. We all did. The sound seemed to hang the way a truth hangs, weightless and absolute. It pressed at my ears and at the inside of my head. The minutes after it fell were slippery. Time thinned, and the edges of things went soft. The map of our journey inverted in the fog. Lena's camera clicked, then froze. Her screen went gray. Marco, who had been noting the position on his GPS, looked at the device and laughed, a small sound of disbelief. When the fog eased, as fog always does, the trail in front of us had shifted. Not moved as in trees lining themselves differently, as I'd felt before, but altered in a way that made the path we had been following continued into a place that did not align on any map.
Where the trail should have taken a right to the river, it instead descended into a square of old machinery half buried in moss. An iron frame, a drum, a remnant of a pulley. The metal's skin was pitted with rust, and in the center of it there were small iron discs polished in places where hands had touched them for years. No one spoke at first. The ledger felt heavy in my pack, as if the weight of the names had shifted with us. On the nearest machine, someone, recently, had nailed a strip of tin that sang faintly when the wind moved. 3 strikes, 1 long, 2 short. It was a cadence that hooked into some place inside the skull and would not let go. Tom reached out and touched the machine. His hand trembled. "They come back in parts," he said. "They leave pieces like breadcrumbs, because they think if they mark it all down, it won't take everything. But it keeps wanting more. We had come to look. We had come to map. We had come with instruments and records. None of it felt sufficient. The fog pressed closer, and beyond, somewhere that sounded like a bell being struck again, this time nearer, someone was moving in the white. We gathered what we could of the apparatus. Lena filmed. Marco took photographs. I wrote names on my pad as they occurred to me, as if writing them might keep them from being stolen. The metal rings answered to one another, a chorus of small domestic sounds that were suddenly absolute and accusatory. The light thinned to a strange, even dusk, though the day was mid-afternoon. As we turned to follow the altered path out, because the trail had remade the world to make us aware, there was a soft tread that did not belong to any one among us. A child's laugh rose, not cruel, but empty as a cup waiting to be filled. The laugh came from deeper in the trees, where the trail had twisted away from our maps. I reached for the ledger instinctively, as if the book could tell us what the laughter meant.
Its pages fluttered in my hands like a living thing. The name at the top of the page we had stopped on was one I already recognized from the cemetery: H. Caro. Beside it, someone had written in a cruder hand the same initials that came up across decades: C.M. "Who is C.M.?" Lena asked. No one answered for a long moment. The letter sat there like an unfinished sentence. The bell rang again, closer this time. It was a sound that belonged to the work of hands long gone, and to an appetite that had been fed in silence for years. We stood with our instruments and our records and our fearful, stubborn curiosity, and the forest watched as if it had always been waiting for witnesses. We had not come to stop it. We had come to know what was being kept. As the fog breathed around us and the clanging braided itself into the day, I closed the ledger and felt the thread pull taut. Names, dates, items, and a single, repeated notation that might be a name or might be an instruction. We would follow it. We had no idea where it would lead.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era: We began down the remade path, as one does when there is no other small choice left than to keep walking toward the sound. Esta é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência, e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. We began down the remade path, as one does when there is no other small choice left than to keep walking toward the sound.